This week on the podcast, I have something special for you. I got to interview Dr. Emma Smith and talk with her about what are the silent killers to our relationship. Now, I want to share with you a little bit about her before we get into this episode. Dr. Emma is a licensed professional counselor and a certified trauma and sex therapist. She's dedicated to helping professionals and couples rebuild their trust, deepen their intimacy, and embrace meaningful change. She's got expertise in evidence-based practices like EMDR and the Gottman principles, and she pairs her clinical methods with a unique philosophical approach to foster growth and alignment. Dr. Emma is based in Nashville, Tennessee, and provides both in-person and virtual sessions tailored to her clients' unique needs. It was such a pleasure to interview her and to just hear her perspective and point of view on some of these silent killers that are really impacting our relationship. And I know you're going to enjoy this episode. So go grab a warm drink, maybe pen and paper, and let's get to it. Welcome to Relationship Reset, Reignite, Reconnect, Rebuild, the podcast for high-achieving couples who want to transform their relationship from surviving to thriving. I'm Katie Russler, a relationship coach and counselor with over 15 years of experience helping busy, overwhelmed couples rebuild connection, trust, and intimacy. If you've been together for years and feel stuck on autopilot, disconnected and frustrated by constant miscommunication, you're in the right place. Each week, we'll explore practical tools, relatable stories, and strategies to help you reignite the spark, rebuild your bond, and create the relationship you've always dreamed of. Because no matter how long you've been together, it's never too late to hit reset. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the podcast. I have Dr. Emma Smith today, and I'm going to be honest, I had snooped on her Instagram and found the 7 silent killers that can lead to divorce, and I was like, I'm here for you. Dr. Smith, I want to know these things because I know my listeners want to know these things. So we decided to condense it to 3 because 7 is a lot for one podcast episode. Today, we're going to be discussing what are those 3 silent killers that you and or your partner may be doing in your relationship and what we can start doing. She's going to give us a practical tool at the end of what we can start doing to start to shift those things. So, Dr. Emma Smith, thank you so much for being here and sharing your words of wisdom with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Share a little bit more about yourself and how you got into the world of explaining things like this to couples and individuals.
Yeah. So I grew up in New Jersey, and originally I was a high school English teacher, actually. And then I decided to make the leap into mental health, and I got into trauma, and I worked with a lot of survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual trauma and that kind of work. And I loved it. I mean, I just got to work with some of the most wonderful people that you could ever possibly imagine. But when I was working in the field of trauma, we had all these great tools, right? We had EMDR that was coming out, and we had cognitive processing therapy and just wonderful, wonderful tools, right? But what happened, I noticed that when people, when we brought people in, we would minimize their symptoms, which was great, right? And then when we kind of got them back to neutral, we would say, okay, go out into the world, right? But I think because I had been working with people who had an intimate partner wound or a sexual wound, sometimes people would come back and they would say, I just don't feel in my body, or I can't connect with my partner, right? Even if they had moved on into a healthy relationship, or they were single when their trauma happened and then they got into a partnership and suddenly they're like, my partner is wonderful. Why am I being triggered? Right. And so we would do some additional work. But then I was like, we really got to get into embodied pleasure. Like, why don't we stop treating that as a luxury item for survivors of trauma? And so that's how I got here. And so when the pandemic hit and, people were making their sourdough, and I'm terrible at all of that, apparently, I went back to school and I got my PhD, and I also became a certified sex therapist. And so now I have a practice in Nashville, Tennessee, where I mostly see individuals and couples who are working to reclaim their desire and their relationship to pleasure, and sometimes for the first time.
I love that the failure of the sourdough bread was like the calling of I got to go get my PhD and then sex therapy certification. Like it was like, nope, not for me. Okay, let's go to university again. I mean, we're all stuck inside. Why not? But
Right.
truly, to go and realize, like, hey, I want to start really exploring and better understanding what's going on with couples, what's going on with the trauma work, and how we go beyond baseline for our clients. I love that. Well, let's dive into how did this come about? The seven silent killers that can lead to divorce. Like, what inspired you in the work that you've been doing to want to bring those to the forefront?
Well, I think that sometimes we treat divorce like kind of the same way that we treat you'll hear people talk about infidelity, right? They're like, it just happened. And you're like, no, it didn't. No. Nobody trips and falls into somebody else's bedroom, right? Like it's
Right.
not there are things that happen and truly there are so many on ramps and off ramps on this road, right? And I'll be honest with you, I've been divorced, right? And so some of this is even from my own work where I'm going back and I'm looking at it and going like, oh yeah, that probably would have been good to know back then.
Check. That's it. Yep.
Oopsie, did that one, you know? And so, and having the humility, and I think, one of the cornerstones of my work is being real, right? Because my parents, they're so funny because they're like, do you just talk about all the things that aren't polite to talk about? Like, right? Are you trying to do that? So, and I'm like, no, but I can see how you got that impression, right? They are very proud of me. Some of the topics I talk about are challenging for them. So,
Right. They're wrapped in shame and guilt and that feeling of failure. And I think that's why we hide a lot of these silent killers and we try to stuff them down and go, no, 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 it's not there. But they do, like you said, oops, the divorce happened. Like,
right. Yeah. And there's so many different things. I mean, I've watched people work through pieces of trauma or pieces of relationship conflict that I'll be honest, like if I'm like, oh, if I was in their shoes, I don't know if I'd be able to do this. So I think that there's so much hope. And we just have to have honest conversations about what are we dealing with, right? And if you're willing to do the work, a lot of the times I've watched people salvage things that when they first came in, I went, ooh, all right, well, let's see how this goes,
yeah.
And so, but we just have to talk about it.
Well, and you just brought it up, like when they're willing to do the work. Dear listener, when you listen to what these three silent killers are, understand if you're willing to do the work, you can reverse it. This is
Yes.
not like there's the nail in the coffin. Truly, you can reverse it, but it takes work. When they talk about marriage is hard work or even any serious relationship is hard work, it's mainly because it's about you doing your own work
Yes.
and your partner doing their own work. And then the relationship starts to have a rhythm because you're doing the work. So, okay, let's pick three of those silent killers. I want to hear your first one. And I know you have a great story to go along with it.
Okay. So I think the first one is contempt. So when, the Gottmans, who are very popular, they talk about the four horsemen. The one that seems to be kind of like the linchpin for all of the other ones is contempt. And I think that contempt is kind of like the equivalent of a slow leak in a relationship, right? It's one that starts to seep in over time. And so if you think about it, like you watch people who are down the road when their relationship has a lot of contempt, it's this disdain, it's this condescension. We just have to recognize, like, if you don't do something about that slow leak, you are going to end up down the road with a flat tire. It just drains the relationship, it drains connection because the types of relationships that we, hope to support our clients in having are not rooted in disdain and disgust. They're rooted in friendship and love and respect and mutuality and building a life together.
So, what
So,
does contempt look like? Because that's one of the questions I get when I explain the four horsemen. They're like, criticism, figured that out. Yep.
mhm.
Defensiveness, got that. And I say contempt, and they're like, can you explain that one?
Yes. Yeah.
So, share with us. What is that one?
Okay. So contempt is sarcasm, eye rolls, subtle digs, And I think I was saying this to you before we hit record, and we were talking about, working with couples, and I work with a lot of same-sex couples, right? And one of the things I realized is that working with my gay and lesbian couples has made me a better therapist for my straight couples, because there are certain things that we let members of certain genders get away with that, it's just kind of in our, I don't know, in our social upbringing, the fabric, right? I think that a lot of times we don't allow for men to have a lot of emotion, or we allow them to not be very expansive in their, expression, even in couples therapy. And then sometimes we allow women, the female partner, to be very expressive and sometimes shoot those barbs at their
Yep.
male partners, right? And not catch it. And so, but when you have two women, they're shooting barbs at each other, right? And what happens when, when a guy gets hurt like that, sometimes they like shrug it off because, men aren't allowed to cry. But the female partners, right, in my lesbian couples, they will cry, right?
Right.
They will, and it's ouch, that hurt. And so what I realized is, oh, look at I have to be more mindful of my own biases when I'm working with folks. And so a lot of times I end up stopping a session and challenging the man to dig a little deeper into like their emotional content, right? And sometimes I challenge the women about, hey, like, think about how you're saying that.
Yeah,
What's that about?
definitely. I find it also shows up in the no one else thinks that way. Even our kid could have figured that out, right? Like it's in those passive aggressive and then overtly aggressive ways of putting the person down, and you'll hear never, always, kind of what's wrong with it's like you're shaming them. And contempt, I agree with you. It really is one of the silent killers because as you said, it's that slow leak, but when it starts, it's hard to patch that tire. It is so hard to reel that back in because you've given yourself permission to speak that way to your partner.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to change that. Do you find the same?
I do. I do. I find that it's not going to course correct by accident. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term like negative sentiment override and positive sentiment override, right? And I think that when we see contempt, there's so many different things that we do in our relationships that on the surface are neutral, right? It is a neutral act. I forgot to put the milk away, right? Inconvenient, but not a moral failing,
Right.
right? Okay. And so, when my partner comes into the kitchen and sees that I forgot to put the milk away, what is their thought? Is it going to be, ugh, she can't even, you can get a PhD, but you can't put the milk away? Like, what is wrong with you? Or is it going to be, oh, she's like working so hard and trying to do all these things. Like, she didn't even have a chance to put the milk away. Like, you know what? I'm not even going to say anything. I'm just going to go get new milk. Right. So the first one is that negative, right? Ugh. It's anything that anything that we can categorize with that kind of ugh sound is, oh, I'm a negative sentiment override, which probably means that I am at least flirting with contempt if I'm not already there.
Mm-hmm. That is such a great example of like Okay, yeah, I know that one.
Right.
What would you say then is our second one? So we now know that contempt is one of them. What would be the second one that you say is like, yeah, this is a silent killer leading to divorce?
This one is one of my favorites to talk about because I live in the South right now where everybody is very polite. Right. And so the second one is conflict avoidance.
Oh my gosh, yes. One of our favorite topics here on the podcast.
Yes. So conflict avoidance, there is space. And I think that part of being happy in long-term relationships is, yes, learning to let things go. And there's nuance to that, right? It's letting the little things go, but also knowing and having the skill set to be able to bring something to your partner's attention when you actually need to. So you don't actually get to choose not to if you don't have the skills to do that thing. And so a lot of times you'll see that people, stuff their emotions, they suppress them, and maybe they start kind of layering on some of the other horsemen, right? So like they don't have the skills to engage in conflict So they criticize their partner for unrelated things. Or they don't have the skills for conflict, so they just give their partner the silent treatment. Right. And so sometimes the partner, I don't know if you've ever had a couple who says, and I tried to apologize, but apparently I was apologizing for the wrong thing because I didn't even know what I did.
Yeah.
And right. And so learning, how do I engage in talking through problems? And conflict doesn't mean screaming. Conflict means you and I are standing on opposite sides of any given topic, but it doesn't mean that we have to go at each other. And I think that we think of it like stepping into a boxing ring, and it doesn't have to be that way. It just means, hey, we're in tension. And sometimes, honestly, like, you need a little conflict, actually, I think, to keep things, honestly, to polish one another. When they talk about like polishing stones, right? In a tumbler, there's all this grit that is going around. The stones are bouncing across one another. You can tell my Instagram algorithm. I have a lot of stone tumblers on my Instagram right now, right? But I'm fascinated by it because all of these bumpy, jagged rocks go in and they just rub on each other and they come out beautiful, right? So I think that like sometimes conflict can actually force us to refine our positions, and it's healthy for self-discovery. I think it's healthy for growth to keep discovering your partner as this whole separate other human being. That can be great for many reasons, but we don't necessarily think about conflict as a vehicle for that.
Absolutely. I agree with, I think a big part of the avoidance also is, and I've talked about this in the podcast before, is the inability to sit with the uncomfortable, right? There's a frustration tolerance you have to have. And if you have a background of, as you shared in the beginning, like trauma or negative history with relationships and communication, you're going to have a hard time with tolerating the uncomfortable emotions that come in conflict. And I love how you reframed it as like, this is actually a really great tool for connection. So don't shy away from that. Don't be afraid of that. When you notice sort of the conflict avoidant person in session, what does it look like? How do you go, yep, okay, we need to pull this to the forefront?
Yeah. So sometimes they actually physically withdraw their body from their partner. That's one that I see a lot, and they don't even necessarily know that they're doing it. Or they will have been looking at their partner and suddenly like they start looking down. Right. And they just seem to, a lot of people who use avoidance as their method of conflict, I think try to make themselves smaller in those moments.
I would agree. I hadn't thought about, but you're right. When that kind of look down or look away to the side, and you're right, they make themselves smaller. It is like, I always say it's like the adult was in the room and then all of a sudden the little kid came, or the pissed off teenager if you start crossing your arms, right? Like, but you shift
Yes.
into a different mode of being. Okay. What is your third silent killer for us?
My third silent killer is unresolved trauma.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Speak to this for us. We need to better understand, one, what trauma means, because everybody will say, well, it wasn't that bad. Other people have it worse, and they don't understand what trauma really means. And two, what does it mean that it's unresolved? Because we kind of think we understand, but there's a book, The Body Keeps the Score. There's a whole different level to it. So explain what trauma means and what it means for it to be unresolved.
Yeah. So when I think about trauma, what I think about is an overwhelm of somebody's coping mechanisms, right? And ability to self regulate at the time an event occurred. And so, it's going to look different for everyone, right? And so when I used to work for the Marine Corps, I was not in the Marines, but I used to work for the Marine Corps. And they would talk about, people who experienced a firefight, right, in combat, because this was back in like the, 2009, 2012, like time frame, right? And they were talking about, people experiencing combat, and one person, they could have been standing right next to each other. One person came back and really had a lot of time, like dysregulation and a ton of issues. And then the other person seemed to almost like shrug it off, or it was expressing like relief that it was over and that they survived, and then seemed to kind of move on, and they couldn't figure out like why is this? So it's very individualized. So we can't go, oh, somebody else had it worse because it doesn't matter. It happened to you. That's number one. And then, with the unresolved piece of it, it's, I kind of tell people, it's like, we're never going to make something egregious that happened to you not egregious. But what we want to do is be able to turn down the volume so that should a reminder come up or should you find yourself thinking about that thing, that you're able to stay in the driver's seat of your own life, right?
Right.
That you're not going into an activated brain where you're into fight, flight, or freeze. We want you to be able to stay grounded. We want you to be able to stay in the present and go, yeah, that sucked, right? Like I think that is healed trauma is like, when you look at that memory or something like that, you go, ugh, that was awful, right? But it doesn't do anything to your body in the here and now.
Right. So if you're arguing with your partner, if you're in conflict and all of a sudden you feel this like, whoa, what is this coming? You're not conscious usually of it. Like you're like, "Ugh," but your partner's like, where did that come from? This feels like bigger emotions than what happened, the milk left on the counter.
Yeah.
That's a good indicator of what you're talking about. There's something unresolved, and depending on the magnitude of the emotion, can be trauma related.
Yeah. And, the things that we think about as trauma, it's really the experience. So the milk on the counter, I did not plan this, but this is a great one because food insecurity is actually one that I hear come up a lot as this kind of, I don't think that we have been taught to think about food insecurity as trauma, but, the milk being left on the counter and the one person's like, whatever, it's, $5, we can go get another one. And the other person is like, how could you do this? And the number of times that there was a disparity in socioeconomic status growing up between these two people and the milk on the counter, it's not about the milk, but it's about what it meant.
Yep.
Right. What does it mean to have to throw something out that shouldn't have otherwise been thrown out? Right.
Yeah.
What does it mean to have waste? What is your relationship to waste? And sometimes that has some really deep wounds. And so I think that when we can bring people in and we can slow down conversations to be able to draw that out, well, now we're not even talking about the milk anymore. We're talking about a little kid who maybe made a mistake and somebody else had this big, scary overreaction that overwhelmed their coping strategies as a kid, right? And created this disconnection of relationship. And that's really, trauma is about disconnecting and being disconnected from our home, and home is in relationship. I really do believe that.
Yes, absolutely. So, as we look at contempt, conflict avoidance, and unresolved trauma, there's probably a listener who's like, oh, no, like I see it. Check, check, check. Or they might be doing what many of us do. Oh, yeah, my partner. Oh, yeah, check, 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 right? So much easier to see them than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
What would be step one for them to do in response to this? Like, okay, I see it. I have this problem with contempt, or my partner does this. What would be the first thing you'd tell a couple in front of you that is like, now we're scared, we're worried, are we going towards divorce because we do this?
Well, I mean, if they're sitting in front of me, I'm like, well, you're here, so you got step one was recognizing that there was a problem, right? Something was amiss. So this is great. Step two is realizing that like this is figure outable. I mean, when we talk about predictors of divorce, we're talking about things if they don't change.
Yep.
Right? If they don't change, this is probably where this is going. Some people, and we say predictors of divorce, but like there are people who are super committed to staying married, right? And they will just be miserable. They won't get divorced, but they will be really unhappy. And so even in those cases, we're just kind of like, hey, but change is possible. There are so many on-ramps and off-ramps. And there is an off-ramp. And here's what we do. And the best way to get off this trajectory is together. So
Right. That would be the easiest. That
yes.
really would be the easiest if we do this together. Okay. If somebody's listening and says, I need to talk with my partner about our patterns,
Mhm.
can you give us kind of a good even example of like how to start that conversation and how to approach it? I feel like that's always key. It's like how we approach it says so much more sometimes than the words that we say.
Yeah. I mean, I think that approaching something with curiosity is really important. I think that sometimes instead of an accusation, we can say, I've noticed that we don't feel as connected. One of my magic phrases that I say to folks is, I feel far away from you, which is it's an I statement. It's not accusatory, but it is sending up kind of a flare saying, like, I am feeling this disconnection from you and I would like to do something about it. I love using podcasts as examples. Hey, I was listening to this thing and they said, would you listen to it too? Or can I tell you about it? I want to get your thoughts on this. Like approaching it with curiosity and inviting the other person in. It's amazing how many of my couples who are in distress stopped doing that. They stopped inviting each other into community with whatever it is that they're engaging with, whether that's a podcast or a book or a Netflix series, whatever, and saying, like, what do you think about this?
I think that is so important because often we have thinkers and feelers, right? We're attracted to each other. And usually the feeler is the first one who's going to pick up listening to the podcast, that reel on Instagram, that blog post, that video. And the thinker is going to be like, oh, you're putting your feeling stuff on me. I don't want this. But if you say, what do you think about this? What's your opinion? You have struck the chord that they like to answer. Oh, well, I do want to share my thoughts and opinions with you. Let me do that. But first, I have to listen to be able to share that. So I love that you added that key piece. Yeah. What do you think of this?
Mhm. And they may come up with something completely different. And then you get to say, well, this is where it made me go. I was thinking about how we used to be or how much fun it was when we could XYZ, and stop not necessarily focusing on the negative pieces. But if you think about it, we're talking about two people who at one point probably couldn't get enough of each other.
Hmm.
Right? Because most of us aren't in arranged marriages these days,
Right.
right?
Right.
You chose this person, and at some point you thought that they were pretty great, right? So,
Hopefully, yes. Yeah.
what was that about? And can we go rediscover who that person is?
I think what's really important because so many of the couples I work with are together for 10 plus years is the reminder that even though you've had the same person in front of you almost every day, you don't really know who they are because you both have grown and changed unless you're taking the time to ask curious questions to get to know each other. And that's where I do see the contempt, the conflict avoidance, the unresolved trauma really start to creep in even more. It's when we stopped taking the time to get to know our partner because we assume we know them.
Yes.
And you don't. I even think, wow, I'm still discovering so much about myself. There's no way my partner knows all these things. It's absolutely a journey, and we forget to go on it together.
Absolutely. And, in my realm, in the sex therapy realm, right, we talk about, familiarity breeds connection and intimacy, right? That's lovely. However, eroticism requires mystery. And I always tell people, we like unwrapping presents,
Yep.
right? I mean, somebody can give you something and that's great, right? But if you get to unwrap it, like that is part of the experience, right? Is unwrapping this thing and discovering. And so in relationships, sometimes when I have couples who come in and, they say, maybe there's contempt in the relationship, there's conflict avoidance, they're not talking. Well, guess what's also not happening?
Hmm.
They're also not having good sex or at all sometimes. And one of the things that we talk about is like when you start to discover your person again or as a whole separate human being, some of the mystery comes back too.
Yep.
And that can reignite. And then, that reignites desire. And then that can create more connection, which can breed the closeness. And then the cycle goes on. So, yeah, it's important for that part too.
Definitely. I agree. Now, I feel like you did a good job of peppering some tools in throughout each one of these, but I know you have one really big kind of homework assignment for us to do that I love. And I think it's such a great perspective. I've not heard someone use this in a long time to make you go, okay, stop the way you're thinking and let's think a little bit differently. So will you share with us the homework assignment you have for us?
Yes. So the homework assignment is I want you to picture your partner standing in line at, a coffee shop, Starbucks, whatever's near you, right? And somebody walks in behind them and this person is attracted to your partner. And so as they are standing in line, waiting patiently for their coffee, they are noticing something about your partner. And so, what I ask people to think about is, what is the story that this person behind your partner is telling themselves about your partner in this moment? What are they imagining they're listening to? What are they interested in? How would they start conversation with that person? How would they keep that conversation going with that person? I mean, if you think about the things that we used to do, I was talking to one of my clients earlier this week who was talking about how silly flirting is. And I was like, yes, it is silly, but your brain is on drugs when you're doing it the first time, right? You're just like all of this oxytocin. So you're willing to do the silly thing. And we ended up truly like belly laughing over the fact that both of our partners are really into coffee, right? And all of the ridiculously specific questions that we were enthralled about asking about coffee. Oh, so which roast do you think is the best? Right. And I have personally never cared. Well, I couldn't tell you what the roast is on my coffee now. Right. But we are just we are enthralled and we are going to grasp at anything. And believe me, this person behind you would be doing the same thing, right? Yeah. Because they want to know. And so wouldn't that be interesting if we saw our partner through those new eyes sometimes?
Yeah, change our perspective and see them as that attractive person in front of us that we're like, how do I talk to them? Like, oh, I like their watch. Oh, wait. Oh, I noticed they said this. Oh, they're reading that
Yeah.
newspaper. Oh, how do I get in their world?
Yes. Right. But I mean, people ask about phone cases, people ask about clothing items, people ask about, I don't know. Oh, have you lived here long? I'm new in town, right? Like there's just all of these things I think about that people say to one another when they're trying to get a way in to talk to somebody that they want to talk to. And that person that may want to rediscover is like in your living room right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was just thinking oh, you sound like you're from a foreign country, living in Europe, everybody sounds like, oh, tell me about where you're from. But you're right. They're in your living room. So what types of questions would you like to ask? How would you like to be connected with that person? How many dates do you want to have before it goes to the next level? Like having that, again, that playfulness. I love that our homework is to be playful in that way.
Yeah. And just see this person differently. Right. Because somebody else can do that right now. And I'm not saying that in like a foreboding way, but it's just kind of this idea that like it is actually possible because somebody else could do it right now.
Right. Because you did it. You did it. Yeah.
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 And if you
Absolutely.
stood in line behind somebody else at a coffee shop, like if you yourself and looked at the person in front of you, and started telling a story about them, like you could do it. So this is not like a stretch. This is just putting on a different pair of glasses, right? And seeing our partner in that new way.
I love this. Thank you so much. Okay, if people want to connect with you, if they want to read more about the silent killers, I'll make sure the link to that blog post is below. But if they want to connect with you and learn more about what you teach, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Emma Smith, PhD. And so I post reels and talk about these kinds of things a lot. I also have a Substack called The Intimate Philosopher. And so you can go there and subscribe for free. And if you go there, I have a downloadable kind of gift that is all about finding good quality therapists. And it's called I think it's swipe left, swipe right, whatever, on whichever one's the negative one. So it's about being able to differentiate between finding a good therapist who's going to be a good fit for you. And maybe there's a script in there about how to break up with your therapist if this isn't working for you. So hopefully that will be helpful for folks. And then I have little essays on presence and passion and intimacy and relationships all on there. So that's how they can find me. Thank you.
That's excellent. Well, go and check her out on Instagram. Go check out her Substack and definitely get that list. I'm so glad you have. I know we talked about this before the recording, but it's so important for people to learn how to find the right therapist and what are the red flags, how to know when these are not, these are signs that there's an issue. And also, it's okay if you need to break up with your therapist. I think we often, think like, oh no, they hold the power. No, actually, I'm in therapy. It was very important to me to find the right therapist, and I have not let her go for years. Like, I don't see her every year, but when I need her, I'm like, I'm coming back because I'm not about to go on the hunt again. Because it is a challenge. And as a therapist, I can say it is a challenge. I get it. So good that you've got a resource like that for people. They definitely need to go check that out. I'll make sure all those links are in the show notes again so they can get in touch with you and connect. Thank you, Dr. Emma Smith, for being here, for teaching us, some things that are uncomfortable to talk about. And if your parents listen to this, she is wonderful. And yes, it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but it so needs to be because we need to realize we're not alone.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed this so much.
Good. And dear listener, can't wait to see you next week. Thanks for tuning in to Relationship Reset. If you found this episode helpful, share it with a friend who might need it too. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast. It helps more couples discover these tools to rebuild their connection too. And be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. It's gonna be a good one. Your relationship is worth the work, and the rewards, totally worth the effort. See you next week.